Hello, my name is Julia Streets and welcome to DiverCity Podcast, talking about equality, inclusion and diversity in financial services. On the podcast, we seek to shine a light on positive progress, call out areas requiring further focus, and offer lots of ideas to help drive change. And today, I'm joined by Bunce of Credit Suisse and Ed Thompson of Uptimize. Bunce is the head of Global Markets Technology Core Engineering Strategic Programs at Credit Suisse and has been working in the IT industry for more than 25 years and across many different sectors. Is recognised as a diversity and inclusion leader and influencer, having won many awards including the Financial Times and Heroes Female Champions of Women in Business, the FT and Outstanding LGBT Executive Leader, and the British LGBT Awards. Identifies as gender fluid and non-binary, and so on any given day decides how to express according to gender. And as non-binary, does not identify as either the binary gender of male or female. Welcome to the show.
Hello, Julia. Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure and honour to be here.
Ed Thompson is the founder and CEO of Uptimize. Uptimize helps organisations like Google, Microsoft, JP Morgan attract, hire and retain neurodiverse talent through training and tailored strategy programmes. Last year, Ed co-authored a research report, Neurodiversity at Work, produced with the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development. And prior to Uptimize, Ed co-founded the Tech City Stars Apprenticeships programme in London, while on the leadership team of a pan-European tech company. So Ed, welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
And as always, at the start of the show, we invite each guest to talk about what they're up to at the moment. So let's start with you. What are you focused on at the moment?
I think I'm focused on a range of different, initiatives. A lot of them are focused around trying to really promote and increase LGBT inclusion. So I'm really proud to be our Credit Suisse co-lead of our LGBT and Ally programme. The main focus of that is really to foster an environment in the workplace and society where, all the forms of diversity is core in terms of its inclusion, and everyone is sort of celebrated rather than tolerated. That involves a lot of different things. Working on making sure that we're included in the Stonewall Top 100 listing is a good example. I do a lot of external partnership with firms such as Stonewall, Gires, Diversity Role Models, Outstanding. Again, really trying to promote, trans inclusion, understanding of different gender identities, and more, generally across the LGBTQI inclusion space. I'm really proud to have several mentees at Credit Suisse as part of our reverse mentoring program. One such example is our EMEA CEO and Group CFO, David Mavers. I'm also Global Head of Group Ops, really trying to promote the importance of diversity inclusion and particularly LGBTQI inclusion at the very top of the house. That spans across outside of the workplace as well. So I'm also doing a lot of work with schools, colleges, universities, again, trying to promote how important LGBT inclusion is. When we've now got sort of 20% of Generation Z millennials identifying as LGBTQI, 12% identifying as gender non-conforming, hence trans, non-binary and gender fluid, it's really important that we as a society make sure our workplaces are inclusive to all of these people to ensure we do build that pipeline of talent. So for me, it's really just trying to focus on making the workplace a much more inclusive, better place and spreading the word about why inclusion is so important and, making sure that it's, top of the house priority-wise.
And we'll certainly be exploring that in some detail in terms of how organisations can embrace this talent group, which is incredibly important. Wonderful. Thank you, Ed, let me talk to you. What are you focused on at the moment?
Yeah, so a big part of our offering at Uptimize is on-demand courseware, online training for employers around neurodiversity at work. And we have just launched a new product, which has actually come from our advisory board, inspired by our client advisory board, which is a 30-minute introduction, 9 modules to neurodiversity at work, designed to be very short, very quick. And I think designed on the basis that ultimately everybody needs to know something about this topic. But actually everybody doesn't necessarily need to know a huge amount. The difference between a complete lack of understanding and even what is there being sort of warped by stereotypes, and actually this sort of mental door open to actually this is, a really substantial part of should be a really substantial part of my daily sort of working life, I think is huge. So we've launched that, excited about that. Obviously working with our existing clients and new clients, and also advocating for neurodiversity at work. And very interestingly, actually in the UK, over the next sort of month or so, talking with people in a number of different sectors. So public sector, finance, talking to people in law, talking to people in media and advertising. And so seeing a lot of different sectors become interested in this topic and actually seeing that debate move from sort of what's this all about to, okay, we think we get it now, and what should we be doing about it?
Which is wonderful, because we are being asked more and more about neurodiversity in the mix of diversity and inclusion as a whole. So, yeah, plenty there to explore as we go through the show. So thank you very much indeed. So, Pips, let me come to you first of all. And as far as you're comfortable to share, we're really interested to hear a bit about your story as well. Have you always presented as non-binary?
I think I know I was perhaps slightly different to other people at a very early age. So for me, it was personally about 4 or 5 years old when I first realised that, I didn't know the terms like gender fluid and non-binary or transgender at that age, but I knew, I like to express differently. So I'd also, I'd like my normal stereotypical, and I don't like to gender stereotype, but I'd like my boy things, but I'd also like to have dresses and tiaras and, make sure I could express in both forms of expression, I guess. Coming out personally and family and friends, etc., always been open and out to everybody. Equally, I've been married for 23 years. My children are now like 22 and 19. Again, they've always known my true identity. But I think, the bigger challenge I personally found was coming out in the corporate workplace. And that was not because the workplace was not ready for that. It was more my own barriers that I put up. I was more concerned about would I be accepted and included for perhaps being different to other people, and more so, did people understand the identity that I'm going to come out as? Because I think I only come out 6 years ago or so in the corporate workplace. I think there was a good understanding at the time of general trans identities, but not so much more of the more, I guess, nuanced or some of their sub identities. So gender fluidity, non-binary, etc. I think I was more concerned that people wouldn't comprehend or accept those. Now, thankfully that's totally not the case. I use that sort of as part of the Ally program to really make sure that intersectionality, across all forms of LGBTQI especially, was included, make sure that trans inclusion was part of that journey. And, the big thing I find is it's all about educating people. I think once people understand that trans is a very wide umbrella, there's a lot of different identities within there, and some of the differences between those, it's a case of bringing them on that journey. And, I've since seen, now that we've got all of the support and infrastructure and stuff in place, so many more people are coming out, both in, the company, in the sector, in other sectors. So I think, the biggest challenge for me was just coming out in the corporate workplace. But I think having ally programs in place made such a difference, because it's quite emotional impacting how much support you do then realize, because you're so worried how people are going to accept you and understand you. But that was, my own concerns were totally unfounded.
And when you're thinking about your day job, because you're incredibly accomplished in the world of technology, and I'm really interested, because it's very, very easy to make assumptions about the type of people who work in technology. Do you think the fact that it was a technology division had a part to play in either the reason why you took your time to come out, or in fact actually was very accepting when you did?
I think, certainly Credit Suisse, we've got large technical departments, we've got business, etc., a lot of different things. No, I think it was more in my own sort of space. I needed to feel that I had support, and I needed to feel ready to embrace my, true authenticity. I've certainly been amazed at the impact and response from people as part of coming out. There's a lot of stuff that we've had to put in place to make sure that we are fully trans inclusive, whether that's, dress codes or trans inclusive healthcare or dual pass cards, or a lot of those sort of nuances associated particularly to non-binary identities. But no, the company as a whole have been absolutely amazing. And, I certainly experienced no challenges or negativity. It was, I was very touched, and continue to be, by how supportive people are in terms of really appreciating someone going out their way to be a truly authentic, because it has such an impact on how committed you are to the firm, how enthused you are, but also the relationships you build with people that you work with. And I make a point of whoever I'm going to see on a given day, whether it's a client or my colleagues or a vendor or whatever, I will absolutely never change how I choose to express on that day. Because, I know that I'm fully supported and accepted.
One of the things we always talk about is the importance of being authentic at work and sort of bringing your true self to work. But also we frame the podcast a lot around, the reason why diversity inclusion matters is about a commercial imperative. And being, the best you possibly can do, being part of high-performing teams. And I'm interested to know whether having presented then as non-binary, whether that's helped you in any way in your commercial accomplishment.
I think it's had a huge impact. Both on how I perform and how I sort of react and, work with the company, but also, I guess, the relationships that I'm forming and, the senior partnerships I'm then involved with. So I think it's definitely had a massive positive influence. I think it really resonates with people if you're being totally open, honest, and authentic in who you are. There's all sorts of statistics from Stonewall and proven sources about how much more engaged and productive people are if they're being authentic and they're not hiding any aspect of themselves. So I think I totally get that. Credit Suisse have done loads of research in terms of how much more financially productive firms are that are diverse. Absolutely. But I think for us, it's more, we know it's the right thing to do. But, I've certainly seen that for me personally. It's had a very good impact. You get the platform, you get the visibility, but you can also influence so many more people because having senior support, having role models at all levels of the firm, and empowering people through that personal lived experience, that makes such a difference. And I think that gets people on board to make sure that they are an ally, because we always encourage people to sign up as LGBT allies because, you can't change the culture of a workplace by writing a policy. You have to change people's hearts and minds and have them really understand why it's important and sort of bring them into the conversation.
And when you talk about having the conversation, one of the things we talk a lot about on the podcast is about race. For example, our very first episode was on race. We talk a lot about race. And the reason we do that is because actually people are inherently, arguably, a little reluctant to talk about race for fear of getting the language wrong. For the listeners, can you provide any colour on what sort of language should we be using?
Sure. It's no wonder that people do get confused sometimes because, even if you look at Facebook, there's like 74 plus different ways of how you can identify your gender identity or gender expression. So, that in itself makes people a bit concerned or apprehensive about using the wrong terms or labels or names or whatever. I think my advice is always, particularly on the whole trans spectrum, it's important to ask the person, see how they want to be referred to. For me personally, I prefer to default to her, she as a pronoun. I like to use MX, which is the gender neutral sort of title. It's important to make sure that your systems and firms have that support in place. But that's different for everybody. I equally know other non-binary or gender fluid people that might default to the other way, want to, change on a daily basis, whatever. It's important to ask what that individual person wants, because it's much better and much nicer for them to know that, you care and you want to do the right thing, rather than just make an assumption. To be honest, it's exactly the same as when we're talking about other forms of LGBT inclusion. Don't always default to referring to someone's husband or wife. Don't assume a given gender in terms of, their partner. So always try and either find out or, use a neutral terminology until you are sure. And the other important thing is people will make a mistake. You can very easily tell if it's intentional or not. Make it clear that if they do, fine, apologize, move on. Because unless you have people feeling happy and confident and empowered to have these conversations and talk about this stuff, that's how you get people informed and educated. And that's where real progress is made.
And I think that there's much of that comes through in neurodiversity as well, in terms of how we describe forms of neurodiversity or attributes of neurodiversity. But before we get into that, Ed, let me bring you in here. So what led you to becoming an authority in the topic?
Yeah, so back to the apprenticeship program you referred to. I'd led talent initiatives in the tech sector in London. I think that had made me realize a number of things. And one was that the talent shortages are real, and it's not simply tech and it's not simply London. These are global talent challenges. Manpower report in 2018, I think, talked about 50% of UK employers struggling to meet talent needs. That's similar to what we've seen in the US. And so after building that, I actually went to the States and I was curious to see what are organizations doing there in terms of alternative talent sourcing. And it was sort of timed with some of the embryonic interest around neurodiversity at work. Now, we actually started by creating some training for autistic job seekers, using some of the same curriculum and tools that we'd used in the apprenticeship program. But it became quite clear actually that, here sort of similarly was a huge pool of talent, and the cog in the wheel was really on the employer side, and employers actually not knowing how to include it. So that's where we decided to focus ever since. We developed a partnership with Microsoft, who are one of the pioneering firms in this space. And we have, I think, realized sort of from the beginning that nobody, not Microsoft, not one particular advisor, not one particular person who has had these experiences would have all the answers here. So over the last 3 years, what we've done is we've built these relationships globally with leading employers, with universities that have really committed time and money to research in this area, to building relationships with neurodiversity thought leaders, but also with the community. And so we've conducted very extensive focus groups to understand, what is it like to, be autistic and have, and go through a corporate recruitment program, and what are some of the friction points, on the basis that, the insights and maybe the identification of some of these friction points can come from anywhere. It can come from a manager at Microsoft, can come from an individual, can come from a thought leader, can come from some research. And what we've been doing is, in the middle of that, taking all of that, packaging it, and then giving that out to employers in a way that they can actually get access to some of those sort of best practice tactics in terms of inclusion.
Can you share some examples on some of the sticking points that individuals or organizations sort of present in the recruitment process?
We like to think about it in terms of attract, hire, and retain. So if you're an organization, you can talk about the recruitment process, but the first problem you've got, in most cases, is neurodivergent people won't necessarily know that you are an inclusive employer. So you look at most organizations, they'll talk about at their commitment to D&I. Very rarely is neurodiversity mentioned in that. So right off the bat, people are thinking, well, maybe this isn't the type of organization for me. They'll see case studies of people from, minority groups, but nothing around this. So I think the first challenge is that, are you building the relationships, and are you sort of push-pull? Are you demonstrating your interest and commitment? And then in the hiring process, I think you've got, potential pitfalls sort of right the way through. These are processes that have been designed for neurotypicals, right through interviewing. That's an obvious challenge. I mean, to some extent, you could say an interview is a test of social competence. So somebody who performs very strongly at a particular task, but less so in a sort of pressured social situation, might be excluded there. And that's actually interesting data point there from Microsoft. So Microsoft, of course, have a brand where people will apply to them. But what they found is that in their autism hiring program, about half of the people who are now on that program and succeeding had previously applied and not got in. So that what they've done is sort of really made tangible this kind of boulder in the road. And of course, it's these friction points, things like job descriptions, busy managers, reusing job descriptions from last year, and that job description includes every possible kind of skill and, attribute, great communication skills, and so on, and a lot of business jargon. These are things that can put people off applying, or in some places can confuse people, from a much broader demographic, maybe veterans who are used to, terminology from another industry, maybe people who English isn't their first language, and so on. So they're pretty simple things to change, generally with universal impact. It's just about, do we know what we're doing?
And when we think about the banner that is neurodiversity, and you mentioned there autism, for example, could you shed some light on other attributes that come through in that community?
Sure. So I think principally when you're talking about neurodiversity inclusion, talking about a number of identity groups, autistic people, ADHDers, and then people with so-called learning differences, so dyspraxic and dyslexic people. But there's a lot of kind of a nuance here. I think that's really important, that each group is extremely varied. So to think that, there's a famous saying, if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. I think you can't stress that enough. The other thing is that people share traits. So we meet people who will say that they are ADHDers and dyslexic, for example. And then, of course, people who are identified as neurotypicals will have some of, or potentially all of the traits of a particular identity group, and not necessarily identify, in that way, but potentially not through having a diagnosis.
And thinking about then the roles, I mean, technology is a very interesting, it's probably the most common one that we hear of. Other roles and responsibilities you mentioned about also different sectors as well. Are there some natural jobs that are well suited to a neurodivergent career group, or does every job have the potential?
I think it's a really interesting question. I think part of the reason we're talking about neurodiversity more and more is because some very glamorous tech companies have hired principally tech workers and had great success with that. So you wouldn't think of actually JP Morgan, for example, as a tech company, but they've been hiring people into their tech teams, and they found that some of those teams have been 50% more productive with their neurodiverse staff. But actually, the way I'd answer this is, in the first iteration of the training we built, we had a module called Suitable Roles. And we had a module called Suitable Roles because we thought probably we would find that there are some, and we would think, like you just asked me there, this would be something of interest to recruiters. And actually over time, and as we, studied this more and conducted our focus group, we realized it's like saying suitable roles for white people, right? It's essentially a needless limitation. And for example, autistic person we spoke to who said, I suppose conformed to some stereotypes around things like, an interest in tech or computing, we would meet people who completely challenge that, people who work with children, people who are salespeople or customer service. So I think it's a needless limitation. I think it's about including everybody. And that's the only way you're ultimately going to get the best talent.
And in terms of organisational considerations, when bringing that talent in, and you say it's partly about attracting, but it's also about retaining and motivating as well, is any particular tips that organisations should think about in terms of supporting that career journey?
I think if you're looking at retention and the organisation as itself, which I think is a good place to start, and with some clients we speak to, they say, we're talking about talent, recruiting people, we don't have neurodivergent people necessarily. And we always tell them, well, in that case, you have a fear problem, because most likely if you're a large corporate, you do, and you don't have a culture where they can be inclusive. So thinking about the elements of that person's experience, that would involve things like the culture, the environment, as Pips mentioned, the policies and the processes. And I think the first thing to do is simply ask yourselves, have any of these been at all shaped with the 100% in mind, as opposed to, say, the 80%? I think if they haven't, that's probably the place to start.
Such as hot desking, for example. People talk about agile working and hot desking, whereas actually for some individuals, the thought of not coming to the same desk every single day, where we've got everything laid out exactly as you left it, could be really...
Absolutely. We've had a really interesting interview in one of our focus groups. A lady who's working very successfully in an organization, and her manager told her that they were moving office to a sort of modern open plan kind of environment. And she said, rest of her team was saying, goodness, great, it's kind of, and she said that was the moment I knew I had to leave, because nobody had asked me about this, and actually there's no way that I was going to be comfortable and productive in that environment. Back to your question, I think I would resist kind of the idea that there is a sort of 2 or 3 point kind of quick fix, but the most impactful thing we've seen and the easiest is to start talking about it. Have leaders say, we care about this. Back to the recruitment website, right? Let's say that actually neurodiversity is part of this mix, because again, potentially we're talking about up to 20% of the population. So really it should be. So let's start talking about it. Let's start what we call flying the flag for neurodiversity. We care about this. This is important. And why shouldn't it be? This is an age where, as you said, tech, analytical skills are valued, where everybody now accepts diversity as a competitive advantage, and everybody will talk about innovation being key. So let's talk about it, let's embrace it, and I think that's where good things start happening.
And I think that's a perfect moment to turn to Robert and to Cynthia for some research to support today's discussion.
Taking a closer look at autistic adults in employment. In 2016, the National Autistic Society found that only 16% of autistic adults were in full-time employment. The autistic community are a diverse group, and specific needs should be catered for on an individual basis. In an article called Neurodiversity in the Workplace, Dr. Kerry Schofield highlights a few areas where broad adaptations can be made.
These are simplifying processes so they are easy to navigate. Keep processes straightforward and unambiguous without increasing the cognitive load unnecessarily. Presenting information in a way that doesn't include sensory overload. Making adaptations to the environment so employees can use headphones to shut out noise if needed, and adjust lighting, or at least provide a quiet space where employees can go for a while if needed. Allowing some flexibility in working hours and working structure. Working 9 to 5, 5 days per week might not work for individuals who like to work alone or prefer not to work intensely for several hours at a time. Try and make it fun and engaging. Work doesn't have to be dull, whatever your neurotype.
The US-based Human Rights Campaign published its latest Corporate Equality Index in 2019. The index rates workplaces on lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer equality. Employers earning top rating took concrete steps to ensure greater equity for LGBTQ workers and their families. HRC President Chad Griffin said the top scoring companies on this year's CEI are not only establishing policies that include employees here in the United States, they are applying these policies to their global operations and impacting millions of people beyond our shores.
According to a 2018 poll by the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development, 72% of HR professionals said that consideration of neurodiversity wasn't included in their people management practices, and 17% said they didn't know if it was in their practices. Organisations could be missing out on the unique strengths offered by those with neurodivergence.
So thank you, Cynthia and Robert, and links to the research can be found on our website at www.diversitypodcast.com. Don't forget that's diversity with a C, not with an S, diversitypodcast.com, where you can find all our episodes and sign up for early notifications of future recordings. Please do follow us on Twitter at DiverCityPod, and Diversity Podcast is available on Bright Talk and all good podcast channels, and we love a rating. It all helps promote the show. So, Ed, I was really interested in what you were saying there about organisations. It's partly about awareness, it's about education, about inclusivity. But anything particularly struck you from what Ed was saying before?
There was so much good content. So, I mean, and I think what really did struck me is the sort of the synergy that I could see between, the content and where you're going with that. And again, what we try and promote in the Ally program. I think the pipeline definitely is so very important because, you need to make sure that you're promoting your firm to the external world as a very inclusive workplace for all forms of diversity, which really dovetails nicely into the whole concept at the moment of intersectionality, right? Everyone is made up of so many different bits. Everyone is the same but uniquely different, and no one fits into one given box. So I think promoting to the outside world that you do accept all forms of people, irrespective. People should be proud of who they are, and intersectionality is important. I think that really resonated.
And I think there is a risk that we do tend to put people in under banners and in boxes as we go as well. Anything particularly that Pips was talking about earlier that struck you as well, Ed?
Yeah, absolutely. Just on that specific point there around inclusion and sort of advertising yourself as an inclusive employer. I mean, I think we're in the age of Glassdoor where people will look at employers and actually get data on that. And I think the SHRM in the US said that about 30% of hires come from internal referrals. So actually, if some people talk to us and say, we're really interested in hiring, but actually often retention and looking at your existing pool, I think, is the best strategy there. Lots of things that Pip said really struck me. One of them was the importance of not just looking at this in terms of policies, but actually really empowering the people in the field. Because what is inclusion? Ultimately, it's about those relationships between team member and team member. It's about the relationship between team member and manager. How do we empower them? How do we educate them and put them in a position to actually live this? That's when you get real organizational change. And the other is, I think the point about individuality is so important. One of the dangers, even with sort of proactive and positive inclusion, is we take these labels, even new labels, and we think, okay, new label X means Y. This is how we respond to that person. And it's incredibly important. What we talk about is kind of two levels of inclusivity. The universal, there's so much that you can do that's good for everybody. But whenever we're talking about an individual, let's really talk about them as an individual. Let's listen to their concerns, their needs, their traits, their preferences, their preferred language, and then let's include them as they would like to be included.
I think that is really, really interesting, Ed. And I think, that totally makes sense to me. And certainly, what made a lot of sense to me when I was coming out was, I needed to be myself and proud of myself. So the whole Oscar Wilde quote of be yourself because everyone else is taken, that applies to every single form of diversity, right? Everyone needs to apply that, be proud of who they are and be their true authentic self.
I think that's a perfect way to end the show. So Pips and Ed, it's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
This episode of Diversity Podcast was produced by me, Kieran Yates, on behalf of Julia Streets Productions. Thanks to Cynthia Akinsanya and Robert Pinto Fernandez for their insights. You can find out more about the guests on this week's show on our website, diversitypodcast.com, and that's diversity with a C, not an S. Whilst you're there, you can also sign up to our newsletter for all our latest updates. To be sure of catching all our future podcasts, subscribe to our feed in iTunes or your favourite podcast app. And if you've enjoyed this episode of DiverCity Podcast, remember to give us a rating or review. It all helps promote the show to a wider audience. Finally, our Twitter handle is @DiverCityPod. Thanks for listening.